Hello my dears, how's it going? Today is another remake of an old Sydney video. It's gonna be the last one for a bit because I don't think I have anything else that I immediately want to revisit, but honestly who knows, that could change. Normally my remake videos involve me playing the old one and then breaking down pieces of it individually, but I decided to just completely redo this one from the ground up, so we have no baby Sydney jump scares today, thank goodness. I will also note that my former HSP video is where I have gotten about 90% of my hate comments on this channel for the entire time that I've been on the internet, so at the very least can we hold all of our angry thoughts until after we watch the entire video and reflected on it a little bit. I love comments. I love getting comments. They're great for the algorithm. But if you have angry ones, if you could just hold them and give them to me at the end rather than just saying things now, that would be super swell. Also, for friends who need it, I am a young white person with light brown, shoulder-ish length curly hair. I'm sitting in front of a plain wall that has green leaves on it, and I'm wearing a white t-shirt with a various shades of blue plaid flannel on top. I think that's everything. Now let's begin with defining our terms, which I'm going to do using the definition given by HighlySensitiveHumans.com. Sensory processing sensitivity, sometimes referred to as highly sensitive person, HSP, is a trait that describes individuals who have heightened sensitivity to environmental stimuli such as sights, sounds, smells, textures, and emotions. This trait is believed to be present in about 20% of the population and is not considered a disorder or a diagnosis. People who are highly sensitive may have a more pronounced response to sensory stimuli than others, and they may need more time and space to process and recover from intense or overwhelming experiences. For example, a highly sensitive person may feel anxious or overstimulated in a noisy, crowded environment, or may be deeply affected by a sad or violent scene in a movie. On the official Highly Sensitive website, there is an Are You Highly Sensitive checklist that includes things such as I'm easily overwhelmed by strong sensory input, other people's moods affect me, I find myself needing to withdraw during busy days, into bed or into a darkened room or any place where I can have some privacy and relief from stimulation, I'm easily overwhelmed by things like bright lights, strong smells, coarse fabrics, and sirens close by, I'm deeply moved by the arts or music, I get rattled when I have a lot to do in a short amount of time, changes in my life shake me up, and I make it a high priority to arrange my life to avoid upsetting or overwhelming situations. There are many more than that, but those are just a couple that I picked out. Now, the concept of the HSP was created by neuroscientist Dr. Elaine Aron and her husband Arthur Aron in the mid-1990s, first published in her 1996 book, The Highly Sensitive Person. Now, any scientific theory, especially a psychological one that is first published in a for-profit self-help style book rather than a peer-reviewed research paper, is one of the largest red flags, but we're gonna get to that later. A lot of the things in this book feel similar to the cultural conversation around Susan Cain's book called Quiet, the Power of Introverts in a World That Can't Stop Talking, where there's a sort of focus on we're different and special and quirky and the world just doesn't get us and we're not wrong, we're just different, in a way that's not directly outwardly overtly ableist on the surface, but backhanded to some degree. A sort of like, yeah, I have this innate sense of traits that makes being a person difficult, but that's not a disability or a disorder. I don't have any of those things. I'm better than those people. Angle that just kind of feels a little off. With HSP in particular, most sources on it specify that it is something that is fairly common and also innate, not just to people, but traits of being HSP have been found in over 100 species, which indicates that it reflects some sort of important survival strategy and that being sensitive is actually an asset in the wild. I wasn't able to find a lot of further information on this claim beyond the constant recycling of it and its existence all over the original HSP website, but I do bring it up for two reasons. The first being that something existing in a lot of species does not necessarily mean it is important to survival. Cancer is a great example of that. And I'm not saying that to say that actually being highly sensitive is a negative thing or a positive thing or a neutral thing. I'm just saying that said correlation relies on a lot of assumptions that find their basis in evolutionary psychology, which is a field of science that is functionally just hypothesis on top of assumption on top of hypothesis, and more importantly, based on eugenesis pseudoscience, and thus is a red flag whenever it pops up as a justification for something existing. I talked about this on my channel last month. I will link that video above. The second reason I bring up this fact is because it seems to me, based on the official HSP website, that sensory sensitivity is something that is primarily self-reported based on a person's lived experience. So I'm a little confused as to how that would carry over to another species that does not have the ability to fill out a self-report or answer questions. To some degree, a level of sensitivity to sensorial input can be measured in an animal based on their response to said input. That's something that could be sort of turned into an objective measure if you wanted to measure it that way, but there's always obviously some danger in looking at something like this in another species because we're going to look at it inherently through an anthropomorphized lens. I once again bring up the example of knowing a professor who researches autism in mice and decided which mice were autistic based on the level of autistic traits they showed. but somebody being perceived as autistic in human culture is directly related to what human culture looks like and how an autistic person interacts and clashes with that culture. And that's not something that can be easily mapped out onto a group of mice because we do not know the intricacies of mouse social norms from a mouse's perspective. And it's definitely not a one-to-one thing. I mean, even with something less complicated like dogs with anxiety and PTSD, it's not a simple map one experience onto another situation. And also, if the existence of HSP is being measured based on a specific scientific quantity of sensory sensitivity rather than a more qualitative analysis of sensitivity, that doesn't entirely line up with what they're primarily presenting HSP to be. And so I don't know how they're categorizing this or classifying this, which might just be a marketing choice, like focusing on the more humanistic side of it that lay people can understand and benefit from while leaving the further research on the back burner, as it were. And that's not unheard of, but again, changing the packaging of something scientific for marketing purposes does always give me a little bit of pause. It's not inherently bad. Capitalism is going to capitalism, and if you have resources that make things better for people, I mean, marketing is going to marketing. That totally makes sense to me, but I'm also not going to inherently trust that on the surface, because if you're trying to sell me a product or even an idea, I'm always going to be a little bit skeptical about your motives and the research behind said motives. Now, on their website, they did link a semi-decent amount of published research available about sensory sensitivity, which is really awesome, and I read all of it. I was struck by the fact that Elaine Aron was a co-author on the vast majority of these papers, and most of the ones she wasn't a co-author on that I could find were by people who had co-authored with her in previous research. That does feel a little bit like a conflict of interest to some degree. I will also note that most of these studies had sample sizes of around 20 participants or less, which is just simply so tiny of a sample size as to not really mean a whole lot beyond a basic exploratory situation, especially for the ones that relied on fMRI imaging, which is notoriously reliably sketchy. And much of this research, both the things that Aron was involved in and articles by others, sourced a lot from the field of evolutionary psychology, which we've already discussed in this video. But honestly, most importantly to me from all of this is the fact that the data that did come up that seemed pretty statistically sound were functionally saying, hey, sensory processing disorder is real, without mentioning the existence of sensory processing disorder, all of which point to the underlying ableism that I mentioned earlier. HSP's aggressive need to separate itself from the concept of disorder despite having significant overlap with disorder. Because while in the process of insisting that sensory sensitivity is not autism, most HSP advocates also firmly imply, if not directly say out loud, that disorder and the lives of people with disorders are inherently negative and inferior. If you're new to the world of disability, that may be kind of confusing because, well, the word is disorder, so like, shouldn't that be a negative thing if a thing doesn't work right? Honestly, that still might be confusing for people who are not new to the disability world. I feel like the colloquial conversation around disability rights is very stuck on like, we're different, not broken, which is the right take. But it is missing a level of nuance because disability rights is not just that being different is great, but also that living a life that is different does not make your life any less worth living than any other, which is complicated and nuanced because, like, chronic pain's not a fun time, but it also doesn't mean that my life is any worse or worth any less than somebody who doesn't have chronic pain. Impairment and disorder can suck. They often do suck, but that doesn't mean that they're inherently bad or negative things, nor should impairment and disorder be reframed as entirely positive things that ignore the fact that they are, by definition, disabling at least some portion of the time. There's been some push in the community to be like, autism's not a disorder, but that completely erases the fact that it is a disability and that disability and disorder are not inherently bad things, they are neutral things. Like, yes, there is much conversation to be had around the fact that a lot of things labeled disorders are tied into Western imperialist capitalistic views of what a person should be, but that again does not make disorder a bad word. The sort of marketing switch from disability isn't a bad thing to difference is great makes sense to me because difference is great can then include a subtext of, but we feel bad for them because life is hard for disabled people, and people don't really have to reframe their thoughts around people that much, but I do feel like this narrative has kind of erased a huge part of the disability rights movement. Anyway, I completely digressed there. The HSP message is the we're just different, we're not broken message that seems all sunshiny and rainbows until they had to start say, oh, also we're not autism, and then began to do so in a way that was very, very negative towards autism and autistic people. So let's talk about the differences. We're going to begin once again with thoughts from HighlySensitiveHumans.com. Autism spectrum disorder is a neurodevelopmental condition that affects social communication, behavior, and sensory processing. Autistic spectrum disorders, ASDs, are a diagnosable condition that is typically identified in childhood, although some individuals may not receive a diagnosis until later in life. Although there may be some similarities between the sensory processing challenges experienced by highly sensitive individuals and those with autism, there are some key differences between the two conditions. For example, individuals with autism may have difficulty with social communication and interaction, while highly sensitive people do not necessarily have these challenges. Additionally, individuals with autism may display repetitive behaviors and may struggle with changes to routine, which is not a hallmark of sensory processing processing sensitivity. Of course, because highly sensitive people don't struggle with changes to routine. It's just that changes in my life shake me up, and I make a high priority to arrange my life to avoid upsetting or overwhelming situations, and I get rattled when I have a lot to do in a short amount of time. Those things are completely different, and you should be able to clearly see the difference between those two things. How dare you think that they're the same? Those are all quoted directly from Erin's Are You Highly Sensitive questionnaire, by the way. In all seriousness, the main thing that is brought up consistently as the difference between HSP and autistics beyond the, well, this is a set of traits and that's a diagnosis, which we've already gone over. Also, aren't all diagnoses just a set of traits? Anywho, is the fact that HSP don't have social challenges and autistics do. HSP don't struggle with social issues like eye contact, recognizing faces, social cues, and knowing the intentions of others. An adult or child on the autistic spectrum, even if high functioning, tends to lack understanding of what is going on emotionally in the other person, whereas those who are HSP appear to have a much stronger understanding and are often hyper aware of what is going on for the other person. High functioning autism is an ableist construct that doesn't exist in a super outdated term. Also, all of this is based on a very specific view of autism, one that is based on the stereotype that autistics are constantly detached from their social environments and do not feel empathy or connected to people or understand the emotions of others. And that can be the case for some people, and that doesn't make their lives any worse either. But it's also not always the case. Many autistics are very aware of every single social cue and just may struggle to respond to it in a way that is perceived as normal. They may completely understand what a situation is, but not know how to interact with it. They may be hyper aware of everybody else's emotions around them and be deeply impacted by them. As an autistic, I did not watch anything with plot for like 6 years of my life because I would get too overwhelmed by all the emotions because I didn't know how to create emotional distance from that, and thus I watched shark documentaries exclusively for 6 years. I would also mention that being hyper aware of everybody's emotions around you does not mean you're actually reading any of those emotions properly, and you can tell yourself that you're right, but you will also probably be wrong a very large chunk of the time. If you need any proof of that, think about how many times you've been convinced somebody was mad at you when they totally weren't. Also, many autistics may not know that they struggle with eye contact because they're so used to masking it until they're given a chance to not have to make eye contact and realize how much less exhausted they are all the time. They may memorize everybody's face that they ever meet. They may not seem to or feel like they display repetitive behaviors, but when you look at the larger picture, you realize that they do a version of the same thing every time, even if it looks a little bit different. Autistics can and often do have imaginations and rich inner lives and feel deeply moved by arts and music. Those things are not HSP specific. Some other arguments about HSP not being autism that I read included the fact that autistics always struggle to regulate their emotions and HSP only struggle with that when they're overstimulated, which feels like there's just a lot of confirmation bias there because you can always come up with a reason that you're overstimulated. I also read that HSP are very good at observing situations and taking in information where autistics don't process as deeply and may be more confused. Also confirmation bias. There was also one that really broke me, and that was that highly sensitive children are creative and likely to engage in lots of things, while autistic children are narrowly focused on certain interests, which can become repetitive and compulsive. I don't know how many autistic children you're meeting, but they're incredibly creative, and you'd have to be looking at them through a very ableist lens of this child plays wrong to miss that level of creativity. I also think it's important to note that many infographics around the experience of being an HSP take autistic or wider neurodivergent traits that are neutral to negative in the DSM and reframe the same ideas to be in a more positive light. And the issue with this is the fact that by trying to create a clear distinction between the two, they're functionally just... There's no better way to put this. They're shitting on autism and creating a sort of, well, we're not as disabled by this as these people are, so therefore we're better, which is just rehashing Aspie supremacy with completely different words. Aspie supremacy being lower support needs autistics, saying they're better than autistics with medium to high support needs and trying to separate themselves from those presentations of autism, and often reframing their version of autism as an exclusively positive thing and even an evolutionary advantage in a way that promotes eugenics. Where have I seen that one before? This language also shows a general concerning level of incompetence around psychology for their precise field of research and so-called expertise, which brings a lot of other things about them into question. And I would give Erin herself a pass for this because this point of view of autism makes sense historically. Many of these ideas around autism were the general narrow-minded medical understanding at the time that this book came out, and really until the early 2010s when conversations started around different presentations of autism, particularly in women and people of color, particularly in what high-masked autism looks and feels like. That's not based on your traditional low-masking cishet white boy who likes math and trains, which started to slowly change the statistics of who was receiving autism diagnoses. Erin was primarily describing the experience of highly masked, undiagnosed autism with some trauma mixed in, but also what autistic doesn't have complex trauma, so it can be really hard to differentiate the two, in the 90s, at a time when that was not recognized societally as a concept. But as the autism in girls conversation expanded in popularity and people continuously pointed out that, maybe HSP actually actually is something else we now have better understanding of and scientifically backed up in research language for, she continued to double and triple down on her HSP theory after being politely corrected according to the new and updated medical knowledge, which is a giant red flag for me personally. I don't really care if you're wrong in the past, that's fine. I care what you do once you learn that you're wrong and how you go about that, and that this is not how you go about that. One piece in particular that I take the most issue with is that she assumed her grandnephews, who are both diagnosed autistic, were highly sensitive children, and did not say anything about suspecting this fact because no one who loves a child or their parents would want to think about autism even when the child in question will eat only exactly 3 kinds of food or is happy for 20 minutes merely watching a bicycle wheel spinning. This is now gone from her website, but it was there for quite some time, thank you to the Wayback Machine. She also cited Curious Incident as her main recommendation for learning about autism, which sure, but the first record of this site is from 2015, and there were many stronger books actually meant to teach you about autism that existed by this time, which again points to her sheer lack of knowledge on this topic and somewhat desire to not gain any more knowledge. Many people in defense of the highly sensitive person will point out that Erin has never majorly directly compared the two, so any ableist language in relation to it is made up by people who want to take Erin down. But if you go back to what the How Does Sensitivity Differ from Autistic Spectrum Disorders, Asperger's Syndrome, etc. FAQ page used to look like, everything that I found that was ableist that we talked about earlier is either directly quoted or directly paraphrased from that page, which was up until well into 2020. That page now simply says, autistic diagnoses can be complex and dynamic. This area is not Elaine's specialty, and she does not keep up on current research. This topic deserves accuracy and respect. Therefore, we advise those looking for more information to seek out autism experts. Just be certain they understand something about innate temperaments such as high sensitivity as well. Also, by framing being highly sensitive as an exclusively neutral to positive thing, people who struggle with these experiences may feel like it's their fault for struggling with it and not being able to just accept that they're different and that apparently that's a great thing, which is just as isolating and individualizing as the you have a disorder and it's your job to fix it medical model of disability can be. But at the very least, the medical model is going to give you some evidence-based tools to help support yourself in these situations, even if they're tinged with a whole lot of ableism. And the thing with HSP in particular that concerns me is that it's often marketed by therapists, by medical professionals, to clients functionally as autism without the stigma, which then delays diagnoses and proper care for the people who need them. I will tell you firsthand that when I was younger in therapy to try to fix my migraines, I was told, you're not autistic, you're just hypersensitive, and that I needed to learn how to control that so I would stop getting migraines, which, spoiler alert, none of that worked until I got an autism diagnosis and found the tools and community that was actually able to help me support myself rather than trying to shove it all in a box and ignore it. You're just unique and quirky, and you is not helpful to somebody who's actively struggling with the things that make them unique and quirky, and also being diagnosed autistic does not make anybody any less unique and quirky, it just gives them the tools to navigate the parts of the world that are disabling to them. So like stigma, I get the issue with stigma, but it just logically doesn't make sense. To some degree, if something is a stepping stone to a diagnosis, that's not inherently bad. Like an autism diagnosis is a big thing to process, and sometimes it takes learning things in pieces before you get to that final destination. For example, I know that I loved Atypical, which is a very ableist show that censors autism in a more palatable way, and that was really huge for me and getting me comfortable watching more autistic representation that then got me to realize that Atypical is ableist garbage. But I don't think we should have to learn things that way, and I also don't think that there are any stepping stone things that aren't to some degree pretty darn ableist just based on the nature of what they are. I'm not going to defend this for that reason, but I can and do acknowledge that for some people, finding a more positive description of different personality traits and lived experiences might help them a lot before they're able to connect that to any sort of diagnosis which involves unpacking a lot of ableism. One thing in particular that stuck out to me was from a Medium article that was pretty measured about both sides of the HSP discussion by Mosaic of Minds and Other Musings, where they said, seeing our sensory processing as a human trait like any other with positive aspects validates us and boosts our self-esteem. It also focuses our attention on where it should be, on maximizing our strengths rather than on feeling shame for how we're made. Which implies that acknowledging that you might have some type of neurodivergence revolves around feeling shame and how you're made and trying to fix it, which isn't totally the wrong take, because based on the medical model, it does. It makes it an individual problem that you have to go fix so that you can better interact with a world that is inaccessible to you. But that isn't the only view of neurodivergence that exists, and it's not the only tone that support systems around neurodivergence have at this point. And that points to more of a flaw in how we talk about these things as a society than anything else, really. But the reason I decided to build this video up from scratch rather than comment on my original video is because in that one, the thesis of it was just this is a new word for autism without being autism in a way that's really harmful, which I still agree with, but there's a lot more to that. A lot of the arguments around why HSP aren't autistic use the prevalence statistics as proof. Autism occurs in 2.2% of the population, and HSPs seem to make up anywhere from 15 to 30% of the population, and most autistics, including younger me, when talking about this phenomenon, sort of brush this comparison aside, especially since we don't really know what the actual prevalence of autism is, because misdiagnosis and lack of diagnosis is still such an issue, and so numbers are fluctuating quite rapidly right now. But a jump from 2% to 15% does feel like quite a lot, and I don't think that's ever going to happen prevalence-wise. And there's enough stories by non-autistic HSP saying, no, genuinely, I'm not autistic, I've tried, in a way where clearly they've done the work to sort of sort that out further, do imply that genuinely non-autistic HSP exist. Where the numbers do start to make sense is the fact that the prevalence of sensory processing disorder in children is around 5 to 15%. It's very common not just in autism, but also in ADHD, Tourette's, epilepsy, dysautonomic disorders, PTSD, and general trauma, people with chronic migraines who make up around 12 to 15% of the population by themselves. I could go on. And obviously many of these things have overlap with each other, but this would explain the seeming prevalence of HSP in the general population. I will also add that sensory processing disorder as a creature is interesting because it's not in the DSM despite lots of push to include it, a large reason being that sensory issues are usually subsumed under a handful of other diagnoses in the DSM, so there's some argument to be had that sensory processing disorder does not exist as its own discrete category, which means that its currently understood prevalence rate is probably lower than what it genuinely is in the population, but that would again contribute to and explain the amount of non-autistic highly sensitive people that exist. The FAQ page about the difference between sensory processing disorder and HSP is still up on her website. It talks a lot about how high sensitivity is not a disorder but a neutral trait. A disorder is also a neutral trait. We've already ranted about that. And something that is evolved in humans as a survival advantage. So that's cool and great and lovely, and I love that we're still having conversations about that. Also, sort of kind of in that vein, but also sort of not really. I want to talk about the broader autistic phenotype for a second, which is something that I don't know if the world is really ready for or able to handle properly. But since discussions about it are already happening and it does sort of tie in here, we're going to touch on it real quick. Basically, BAP is a fairly new concept that is more scientifically backed than HSP is. It's used to describe subclinical autism, meaning that somebody experiences many of the struggles that come along with autism and benefit from autism accommodation, but do not meet all of the diagnostic criteria to therefore get an autism diagnosis. If I understand correctly, this term was created, or at least is most often used, to point out the phenomenon of diagnosed autistic people having family members that may not be diagnosably autistic, but show enough traits as to be notable, especially when it comes to the discussion of genetics and autism. Now, I don't know how to feel about this concept for a few reasons. The first being that the idea of a specifically autistic phenotype makes me a little uneasy because yes, autism is likely genetic to some degree, but I would love to get as far away from the idea of the autism gene as humanly possible because eugenics obviously, and also because eugenics aside, it is way more complicated than an autism gene. So conceptually, an autistic phenotype just feels I would say unwise as a concept. The other reason I'm not sure how to feel about this concept is because there's already this whole issue that I think started on TikTok where people were saying that you don't have to meet the autism DSM criteria to be autistic. And to some degree, right, like you don't need to fit all the criteria perfectly because you're not going to fit all the criteria of something. They're covering a variety of experiences under the same label. And also those criteria were not written in a way that majorly includes minority presentations of autism. But what that doesn't mean is, oh, I meet only half the criteria, so actually I'm autistic. And I worry that the existence of the broader autistic phenotype might accidentally feed into this. It also could feed into the idea that everybody's a little bit autistic to some degree, which is another nuanced situation where I agree that all people have autistic traits because autistic traits are human traits, but that does not mean everybody is a little bit autistic or that everybody therefore understands the autistic experience because they may struggle with a trait or two. There's been some interesting discussion in the community around how part of the boom in autism self-diagnosis post-pandemic is because many autistics hit burnout and thus found that they were autistic, but also that the combination of not being able to socialize for a long period of time and complex trauma has made many people who probably just have PTSD feel like they might be autistic because of the nature of their social struggles, which I think is a really interesting take given that trauma and autism can often present quite similarly. From a more expansive, nuanced perspective, I do think the idea of you're either autistic or you're not, the harsh line between the two, is not reflective of how humanity works in any direction, but I also don't think that we're in a place societally where that conversation can be handled in a responsible manner. The reason I bring this up in this video is because both HSP and BAP are situations where the concept isn't inherently harmful and can be positive if used properly, because the thing is, and we've discussed this before, if a label helps you to find language for what you're experiencing and helps you to find the guidance you need to accept yourself for who you are, to understand yourself, but also at the same time have a constant growth mindset in a way that doesn't harm yourself or other people around you, go for it. The main issue is when these labels cause harm, and in HSP's case, we know that it's caused a lot of harm. It's prevented people from getting diagnosed with autism or another form of neurodiversity and thus getting actually evidence-based care and support. It's spread a lot of ableist misinformation about autism, and its strong level of toxic positivity, it's not disability, it's a superpower. Unlearn your frustration with yourself. Energy has definitely contributed to people's shame around struggling with their sensitivity and finding it disabling to some degree, which also prevents those people from being able to access the care that they may need. I can't speak for any harm caused by the existence of the brighter autistic phenotype since it's not really a much discussed topic yet. It generally seems like the people who dig deep enough to find it and learn about it are pretty knowledgeable about what they're doing with that, kind of in the way that self-diagnosis used to look in the community before it expanded in popularity. So I don't know what that's going to look like in the future. I can't really speak on that. But what strikes me about both of these is the societal feeling of not being allowed to have accommodations or just general needs without a label and an extensive explanation as to why you would benefit from those needs. My last video on this topic was more, this thing shouldn't exist, it's harmful, it's bad, find a new label. But this time around, I realized that really the more important conversation is the underlying issue. Not just that I believe that the HSP categorization is halfway a real thing that exists, but it's more of an arbitrary umbrella category that's unhelpful at best and also to a probably higher degree just a business venture, but also that people are isolated and miserable. They're afraid of the concept of having a disorder and may not trust the medical or mental health care system and are turning to self-help things to try to fix it for themselves. And they don't feel like they're allowed to have and advocate for their needs without an explanation as to why they have those needs. Like, if this many people are connecting so strongly with the highly sensitive concept, that means this many people are struggling with things, likely to a clinical level that they don't have support for, and also nobody's pointed out or caught for them. It also means that, well, yes, there are many situations where accommodations should be prioritized for specific groups of people with higher needs. There is a base level of accommodation that a huge portion of the population would benefit from, that definitely just should be universally available. This is called the curb cut effect, that adding curb cuts into sidewalks mean that, like, wheelchair users can travel from one place to another, but it also means that so can people with strollers and suitcases, or people with bad knees, or teeny tiny dogs with teeny tiny legs that can't do a step. And for everybody else, it's not like the existence of a curb cut is making things worse for them. Other examples of this would be automatic doors, or ingredients lists on foods, or open captioning. Things that HSP would benefit from that could very easily be universal are things like social and visual stories to know what to expect when going somewhere, trauma-informed practices, sensory and trigger warnings, quiet spaces, overall better communication, and increased social acceptability around wearing earplugs in spaces and not touching people without explicit consent. And these are things that are currently primarily marketed toward the autistic population, but should be more universal. And if HSP as a concept weren't so pseudoscience-y, I would argue that their 1 in 5 data would be a really great place to start those conversations and make wider societal changes. But that's not happening for a number of reasons. It just makes me sad that we live in a world where everybody is struggling so much with fixable things. Like, none of these things are going to be manageable, disability is always going to exist, universal accommodation will never be possible, but to some degree there are things we could be doing that we are not, that would reduce a piece of that load for a large portion of the population that we're just actively not doing. But this went in a direction. I think I'm gonna leave this one here since I don't have much more to say on this topic, but let me know your thoughts in the comments. You're also welcome to like, subscribe, join my Patreon while you're down there, do whatever sparks joy. And yeah, as always, thank you for listening, thank you for learning, remember it's never too late to start over, and critical thinking is really sexy. I look forward to seeing you, my dear, in the next one.